The horses were screaming, not the usual neighs or whinnies farmhands recognize. These were sounds of distress, of panic, of witnessing something wrong. 5:45 p.m., June 12, 1987, rural Nebraska, Carson family farm. 18-year-old Emily had been feeding them their evening meal, the same routine she'd done every day since she was 15. Her parents heard the horses from inside the house. By the time they reached the barn, Emily was gone. The feed bucket lay on its side. The horses were wild-eyed, refusing to be calmed. And somewhere across the fence line, a neighbor was washing dirt from his hands, dirt that would wait 37 years to be matched. Lancaster County, Nebraska, stretches across rolling plains where corn grows tall and neighbors are separated by acres rather than fences. The Carson family farm occupied 240 acres, approximately 15 miles southeast of Lincoln, far enough from the city that stars filled the night sky without competition from streetlights, close enough that Emily could dream of attending the University of Nebraska in the fall. The farm had been in the Carson family for 3 generations, passed from grandfather to father to son, and now maintained by David Carson, his wife Margaret, and their only child Emily. Emily Marie Carson was 18 in the summer of 1987, a recent graduate of Waverly High School, where she had been valedictorian of her small class of 43 students. She had auburn hair that she typically wore in a practical braid, green eyes that her mother said came from her grandmother's Irish heritage, and a ready smile that neighbors remembered long after she disappeared. Emily had been accepted to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's veterinary science program with a partial scholarship, planning to start in September. She loved animals with the fierce devotion that comes from growing up surrounded by them, treating every creature on the farm with a gentleness her father said was rare, even among those raised in agricultural life. The Carson farm maintained 12 horses, a mix of working animals and riding horses that the family had accumulated over the years. Emily had named each one and knew their personalities as well as she knew human friends. There was Thunder, the gray gelding who was afraid of his own shadow; Daisy, the chestnut mare who would only eat if someone stood nearby talking to her; Scout, the old bay who had been Emily's first riding horse and now spent his retirement days grazing in the near pasture. Emily's evening feeding routine was sacred time. 45 minutes she spent alone with the horses, talking to them about her day, her plans, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian who specialized in large animals. June 12, 1987, was a Friday. Emily had spent the morning helping her mother in the vegetable garden, the afternoon driving into Lincoln with friends to see a movie, some comedy Margaret couldn't remember the name of later when investigators asked. Emily returned home around 4:30 p.m., changed out of her town clothes into jeans and boots, and joined her parents for an early dinner. The Carsons ate at 5 p.m. every evening, a schedule determined by farm work rather than convention. That night they had pot roast, Margaret's specialty, and Emily talked about her movie, about her friends' plans for summer, about an article she'd read in a veterinary journal. At 5:42 p.m., Emily pushed back from the table, carried her plate to the sink, and grabbed the metal feed bucket from its hook by the back door. "I'll be back in about an hour," she told her parents, the same thing she said every evening. David was reading the Lincoln Journal-Star. Margaret was clearing the remaining dishes. Both would replay this moment thousands of times in the years that followed, searching for any sign they missed, any indication that something was different about that particular evening. But there was nothing. Emily smiled, pulled the door closed behind her, and walked across the yard toward the barn. The distance from the back door of the Carson farmhouse to the barn was approximately 300 yards. The path was well worn, packed dirt that Emily had walked twice daily for years. The barn itself was a traditional red structure, weathered but well maintained, with 12 stalls, a tack room, and a hayloft. Behind the barn, a split-rail fence marked the property line between Carson land and the neighboring farm owned by Thomas and Linda Weber. If you're new to revealed crime cases, this isn't fiction. This is the true story of how an 18-year-old girl with dreams of becoming a veterinarian vanished in the time it takes to feed horses, and how the animals she loved tried desperately to tell anyone who would listen what they had witnessed. Before we continue, take a second to hit that subscribe button. This channel explores America's most perplexing true crime cases, and I promise you, what happened to Emily Carson and how modern soil science finally solved a 37-year-old mystery will demonstrate that sometimes the most important evidence isn't what we see, but what lies beneath our feet. Margaret Carson was washing dishes when she heard the horses. The kitchen window faced the barn, and Margaret often watched Emily's silhouette moving through the structure during evening feedings. At 5:51 p.m., the sounds that came from the barn were unlike anything Margaret had heard in 20 years of farm life. Horses make noise. They whinny for food, nicker when greeting familiar people, snort when startled. These sounds were different. Shrill, panicked screaming that raised the hair on Margaret's arms before her conscious mind registered what she was hearing. She dropped the plate she was washing. It shattered in the sink, but Margaret was already running for the back door, calling for David. Her husband heard the urgency in her voice and the terror in the horse's cries simultaneously. He was out the door before Margaret, running across the yard faster than his 52-year-old body had moved in years. Margaret followed, her heart pounding, her mind already imagining the worst. Emily had been kicked, trampled, injured by a spooked animal. David reached the barn at 5:53 p.m. The horses were in chaos. Thunder was rearing in his stall, front hooves striking the wooden door. Daisy was racing in tight circles, white showing around her eyes. Scout, old and arthritic, was pressed against the back corner of his stall, trembling. Every animal was in distress, but Emily was nowhere to be seen. The feed bucket lay overturned just inside the barn entrance, grain scattered in an arc across the dirt floor. Emily's routine was to fill the bucket from the grain bin in the tack room, then move from stall to stall, measuring out portions for each horse. The bucket's position suggested she had just entered the barn when something interrupted her. The grain bin in the tack room was still closed. Emily had dropped the bucket before she ever reached the feed supply. "Emily!" David's voice echoed through the barn. Margaret arrived behind him, joining the call. "Emily, where are you?" They searched every stall, the tack room, the hayloft. They looked in spaces too small for a person to hide, driven by desperate hope that somehow they were missing her, that she was hurt somewhere, unable to respond. But the barn was empty except for 12 panicked horses and parents whose world was disintegrating with every passing second. At 6:02 p.m., David ran back to the house to call the Lancaster County Sheriff's Department. Margaret stayed in the barn, trying to calm the horses while continuing to call Emily's name. The animals gradually quieted under her familiar voice, but their eyes remained wide, their bodies tense. They knew something Margaret desperately didn't want to believe. Emily wasn't in the barn. Emily wasn't anywhere on the property. Emily was gone. The first deputy arrived at 6:24 p.m. Deputy James Kowalski had grown up in rural Lancaster County and knew the Carson family from community events. He took immediate control of the situation, calling for backup while establishing a preliminary timeline. Emily had left the house at approximately 5:42 p.m. Margaret heard the horses' distress at 5:51 p.m. David reached the barn at 5:53 p.m. Somewhere in that 11-minute window, Emily Carson had vanished. By 7:00 p.m., 8 law enforcement officers were on the Carson property, joined by neighbors who had heard the news over police scanners or through phone calls that spread through the rural community with remarkable speed. Thomas Weber, the neighbor whose property adjoined the Carson farm, was among the first to arrive. Weber was 56, a stocky man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent his life outdoors. He and his wife, Linda, had farmed the adjacent 180 acres for nearly 30 years, and while the two families weren't close friends, they maintained the cordial relationship common among rural neighbors who depend on each other during difficult times. "I was in my workshop when I heard all the commotion," Weber told Deputy Kowalski. "Saw all the vehicles coming down your road. Figured something was wrong. Whatever you need, we're here to help." His face showed appropriate concern, his voice steady with the calm competence farmers develop through handling emergencies. Linda Weber arrived shortly after, bringing thermoses of coffee and her practical presence that many would later remember as a comfort to Margaret Carson during that first terrible night. The initial search focused on the immediate area around the barn and house. Flashlights swept through outbuildings, machinery sheds, equipment storage. Search dogs arrived at 8:37 p.m., German shepherds trained for tracking. They picked up Emily's scent at the barn entrance, followed it in a confused pattern that circled the building twice, then headed toward the fence line separating Carson property from Waberland. At the fence, approximately 50 feet from the barn's back entrance, the dogs lost the trail. They circled, whined, and sat down, indicating the scent ended at that precise location. "What does that mean?" David asked Sheriff William Drayton, who had taken command of the scene. Drayton, a 30-year veteran of rural law enforcement, had seen enough to know that lost scent trails rarely meant anything good. But he wasn't ready to share his darkest suspicions with parents who had lost their daughter less than 3 hours ago. "Could mean she got into a vehicle here," Drayton said carefully. "Or the wind shifted and scattered the scent. We'll keep searching." But his eyes lingered on the fence line, on the clear view from that spot to the Weber farmhouse across the field, on the tractor path that ran along the fence and connected the two properties. By midnight, over 40 volunteers had joined the search. Neighbors walked property lines calling Emily's name. Every building within a 2-mile radius was searched. The county road that ran past the Carson farm was examined for signs of a vehicle stopping, for skid marks, for any indication that Emily had been forced into a car. Nothing was found. Emily Carson had simply disappeared from inside a barn with 12 horses who had tried to scream the truth. The sun rose on June 13th over a community transformed by fear and confusion. The Carson farm, typically quiet except for animal sounds and the distant hum of machinery, was now the center of an expanding investigation. Sheriff Drayton established a command post in the Carsons' living room, maps spread across the dining table, phone lines constantly ringing with tips, sightings, and offers of help. Margaret sat on the couch where Emily had sat just 18 hours earlier, her hands clutching a photo of her daughter in cap and gown from graduation 2 weeks prior. David stood at the window, staring at the barn where his daughter had vanished, his face gray with exhaustion and terror. The Nebraska State Patrol joined the investigation at dawn, bringing additional resources and expertise. Special Agent Carol Martinez, who specialized in missing persons cases, arrived at 7:30 a.m. to coordinate the expanded search. Martinez was 43, 15 years into a career that had shown her the worst of human nature. She had worked kidnappings, runaways, and cases where missing persons were found, and cases where they never were. Emily Carson's disappearance had characteristics that troubled Martinez immediately. No signs of struggle, no evidence of flight, no witnesses, and animals that had clearly witnessed something traumatic. "Walk me through the timeline again," Martinez said to David and Margaret, her voice gentle but insistent. David recounted the evening for what felt like the 100th time. Emily left the house at 5:42 p.m. She was carrying the feed bucket, wearing jeans, boots, and a University of Nebraska t-shirt that her grandfather had bought her. She was in good spirits, had shown no signs of distress or fear. Margaret heard the horses at 5:51 p.m., 9 minutes after Emily left the house. The barn was 300 yards from the house, a walk that typically took Emily about 4 minutes at her usual pace. So she had approximately 5 minutes in the barn before the horses started making noise, Martinez calculated. 5 minutes for something to happen that caused 12 horses to panic simultaneously. She made notes, her expression thoughtful. "In my experience, horses react to violence, to sudden fear, to things that violate their sense of safety. Whatever happened to Emily, those horses witnessed it." The physical evidence from the barn was limited, but significant. The overturned feed bucket suggested Emily had been startled or grabbed suddenly. The arc pattern of the scattered grain indicated the bucket had been dropped, not placed down. Crime scene technicians found Emily's footprints in the loose dirt near the barn entrance, her boot treads clearly visible. But there were other prints as well, larger boot prints that came from the direction of the fence line, approached the barn entrance, then retreated back toward the fence. The prints were photographed, measured, and cast in plaster for analysis. Most intriguing was what the forensic team found along the fence line where the tracking dogs had lost Emily's scent. The split-rail fence was old, weathered wood with gaps wide enough for a person to slip through without climbing. On the Carson side of the fence, technicians found disturbed soil, as if something heavy had been dragged. On the Weber side, they found tire tracks. The tracks belonged to a tractor, based on the distinctive tread pattern and width. The tracks approached the fence, stopped, then retreated toward the Weber property. Sheriff Drayton stood at the fence line at 10 a.m., studying the evidence with Agent Martinez beside him. The tractor tracks suggest someone drove from Weber's property to this fence line around the time Emily disappeared, Martinez said. The soil disturbance suggests something or someone was moved through this fence. The dogs lost her scent here, which often means the subject was placed in a vehicle. Thomas Weber owns the property on the other side, Drayton said carefully. He had known Tom Weber for 20 years, had bought hay from him, had served on the county agricultural board with him. Weber was respected in the community, a deacon at Waverly Lutheran Church, a volunteer firefighter. The idea that Tom Weber could be involved in Emily Carson's disappearance seemed impossible, but evidence didn't care about reputation. At 11:15 a.m., Agent Martinez and Sheriff Drayton drove to the Weber farm to conduct a formal interview. The Weber property was similar to the Carson farm, a modest two-story farmhouse surrounded by barns, equipment sheds, and fields stretching to the horizon. Linda Weber answered the door, her face showing the strain of a sleepless night. She led them to the kitchen where Thomas Weber sat at the table, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him. "Tom, we need to ask you some questions about last evening," Drayton began. Weber nodded, his expression appropriately serious. He recounted that he had been working in his workshop, a converted equipment shed about 200 feet from his house, from approximately 4 p.m. until Linda called him for dinner at 6:30 p.m. He was repairing a cultivator, a task that required welding equipment and concentration. He hadn't heard anything unusual from the Carson property, hadn't seen anything suspicious. "Did you use your tractor yesterday evening?" Martinez asked, watching Weber's face carefully. Weber shook his head. "Tractor's been parked since Wednesday. I've been focused on getting that cultivator fixed before planting season ends." He led them to the machine shed, where an International Harvester tractor sat, dust on the hood, no signs of recent use. The tires appeared clean, no fresh mud or soil visible. Linda Weber confirmed Tom's timeline. She had been in the house all evening, preparing dinner and watching television. She called Tom to dinner at 6:30 p.m. And he came directly from the workshop. They ate together, and then Tom went to bed early, around 8:30 p.m., exhausted from the day's work. They didn't learn about Emily's disappearance until the next morning when a neighbor called. The alibi seemed solid. Tom was in his workshop, Linda was in the house, both could account for each other's whereabouts. But Martinez noted something that troubled her. The workshop had no windows facing the Carson property. Tom claimed he was welding, work that required protective gear and created noise that would mask sounds from outside. He could have left the workshop for 30 minutes without Linda noticing, especially if she was watching television. And the tractor, while appearing unused, could have been cleaned. Rural farmers knew how to remove dirt from equipment. It was part of maintenance. "We'd like permission to search your property," Martinez said. Weber didn't hesitate. "Search whatever you need. I want Emily found as much as anyone." He signed the consent form Sheriff Drayton provided, giving law enforcement full access to his buildings, vehicles, and land. The search of Weber property began at 2 p.m. and continued until darkness made further examination impossible. Every building was inspected: the house, the barn, equipment sheds, the workshop, grain storage bins. Technicians examined the tractor more thoroughly, taking soil samples from the tires and undercarriage. They found nothing immediately suspicious. No signs of Emily, no evidence of violence, no indication that anything criminal had occurred on Weber's property. But the soil samples were carefully bagged and labeled, preserved for analysis that 1987 technology could barely begin to process. The samples contained dirt, plant material, pollen grains invisible to the naked eye. In 1987, soil analysis was primitive compared to what would become possible decades later. Forensic geology existed, but was rarely used in criminal cases. Pollen analysis was even more specialized, requiring experts and equipment that small county sheriff departments didn't have access to. The samples were stored in the evidence room, tagged with case numbers, and largely forgotten as the investigation pursued more promising leads. The search for Emily expanded throughout the weekend. Over 200 volunteers combed fields, creek beds, abandoned buildings, and roadside ditches across Lancaster County. Helicopters with infrared cameras searched from above. Dive teams examined farm ponds and the small creek that ran through Carson property. Every registered sex offender within 50 miles was interviewed and their alibis verified. Truck stops along Interstate 80 were canvassed for anyone who might have seen Emily or noticed suspicious vehicles. Tips flooded the sheriff's department. Emily had been seen hitchhiking near Lincoln. Emily had been spotted at a gas station in Omaha. Emily had run away with a boyfriend nobody knew existed. Each tip was investigated, each lead pursued to its inevitable dead end. Emily Carson had not run away. She had not gone willingly into any vehicle. She had been taken, the evidence suggested, but by whom and to where remained mysteries that seemed to grow more impenetrable with each passing hour. On June 15th, 3 days after Emily's disappearance, a letter arrived at the Carson farmhouse. The envelope bore the University of Nebraska Lincoln logo. Inside was Emily's official acceptance packet, orientation schedules, dormitory assignments, and a welcome letter addressed to Miss Emily Carson, class of 1991. Margaret opened it at the kitchen table, surrounded by family members and neighbors who had gathered to provide support. She read the first line. Congratulations on your acceptance to the University of Nebraska Lincoln's College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources, before her voice broke and she could read no more. The letter sat on the table for the rest of the day, a tangible representation of the future Emily would never have. David stood over it for long minutes, his hands clenched into fists, his face working through emotions that had no adequate expression. His daughter had dreamed of this acceptance for years, had worked tirelessly through high school to earn the grades and test scores necessary for admission, had already begun planning her course schedule, thinking about which professors to study under, imagining herself in lecture halls and laboratories. All of it was gone now, reduced to a cruel piece of mail that arrived 3 days too late to mean anything except more pain. Agent Martinez stayed in Lancaster County through the following week, coordinating with local law enforcement and following every potential lead. But as June turned to July, the hard truth became unavoidable. Without witnesses, without physical evidence pointing to a specific perpetrator, without Emily's body to establish cause and manner of death, the investigation was stalling. Thomas Weber remained a person of interest, but interest wasn't evidence. His alibi held up under repeated questioning. His property search had yielded nothing incriminating. His cooperation appeared genuine, his distress over Emily's disappearance seemingly authentic. I've seen guilty people maintain innocence, Martinez told Sheriff Drayton during a case review on July 8th. But I've also seen innocent people destroyed by suspicion. Right now, we have circumstantial observations and no evidence. The tractor tracks near the fence could have been made any time in the previous week. The boot prints in the barn don't match Weber's boots, and we can't prove they're connected to Emily's disappearance. Without more, we can't build a case. The Carson family struggled to accept this reality. David visited the sheriff's office weekly, asking about progress, pushing for answers. Margaret attended every community meeting, every vigil, every organized search, holding Emily's photograph and refusing to surrender hope even as days turned to weeks. The community rallied around them with the fierce loyalty small towns provide during crisis. Fundraisers were organized for reward money. Prayer services filled the churches. Emily's face appeared on posters throughout Nebraska and neighboring states. But as summer faded into fall, as the date Emily should have started college came and passed, the investigation lost momentum. Leads dried up. Media attention moved to other tragedies. The volunteers who had searched fields in June returned to their own harvests in September. and somewhere across the fence line, Thomas Weber continued his farming routine, maintaining his machinery, attending church, living a life that appeared completely normal. If he knew what happened to Emily Carson, if he carried guilt for her disappearance, he showed no signs that anyone could detect. The horses, the only witnesses to whatever occurred in that barn on June 12th, returned to their routines as well. But those who knew them well noticed changes. Thunder never lost his nervousness. Daisy required constant reassurance. And Scout, old before Emily disappeared, seemed to age years in the months that followed, as if losing the girl who had loved him drained away his will to continue. He died that December, and David buried him in the far pasture, marking the grave with a simple stone that bore only the horse's name and years of life, unable to articulate the deeper loss that Scout's death represented. By September 1990, 3 years and 3 months after Emily Carson's disappearance, the Lancaster County Sheriff's Department officially reclassified her case from active investigation to cold case status. The decision wasn't announced publicly, wasn't marked by any ceremony or statement. It was simply an administrative change that reflected the painful reality that every lead had been exhausted, every witness interviewed multiple times, every possible scenario explored without yielding answers. Detective James Richardson, who had inherited the case when Agent Martinez returned to her regular duties with the State Patrol, made the notation in the case file on September 14, 1990. Emily Carson, missing. Presumed deceased. Status, cold. For David and Margaret Carson, this bureaucratic designation felt like a death sentence. The first death had been Emily's disappearance that June evening when their daughter vanished, and their world shattered. The second death was the slow realization that she wasn't coming home, that the best they could hope for was finding her body and gaining some form of closure. This third death, the cold case classification, meant that even the official search had ended. The phone calls from investigators stopped, the updates ceased. Emily's case joined the files of other unsolved disappearances, stored in boxes in the evidence room, remembered in annual reports, but no longer actively pursued. The Carson farm continued operating, though neither David nor Margaret had much heart for it anymore. David still tended the fields, still maintained the equipment, still performed the endless tasks that farming demanded. But the work had lost its meaning. He had farmed this land to build something to pass to Emily, to create a legacy she could choose to continue or sell to fund whatever life she wanted. Without Emily, the farm was just dirt and machinery, a prison of routine that kept him occupied but gave him no purpose. Margaret stopped maintaining Emily's bedroom around 1992. For 5 years, she had kept it exactly as Emily left it, dusting the shelves, washing the bedding monthly, preserving it as a shrine. But one morning in March 1992, Margaret walked into that room and realized she was maintaining a museum to her own grief. Emily wasn't coming back to sleep in that bed, wasn't going to return to the books on those shelves. Keeping the room frozen in time wasn't honoring Emily. It was refusing to acknowledge reality. Margaret packed Emily's belongings into boxes, stored them in the attic, and converted the bedroom into a guest room that no guest ever used. The community's relationship with the Carson tragedy evolved through the 1990s. The immediate shock and solidarity of 1987 gradually transformed into uncomfortable awareness that Emily's case might never be solved. People stopped asking David and Margaret if there was news, the question becoming too painful to voice when the answer was always no. The annual memorial services on June 12th continued, but attendance dwindled from hundreds in the early years to dozens by the mid-1990s. Life moved forward for everyone except the Carsons, who remained trapped in June 1987, waiting for answers that never came. Thomas Weber became an unexpected source of support for the Carson family during these difficult years. The initial suspicion that had briefly fallen on him after Emily's disappearance had faded when no evidence connected him to the crime. His cooperation with the investigation, his genuine seeming distress over Emily's fate, and his consistent alibi had cleared him in most people's minds. By 1990, Weber was simply a neighbor who had witnessed the beginning of the Carson family's nightmare and felt compelled to help however he could. Weber stopped by the Carson farm regularly, offering assistance with tasks that David's advancing age and deteriorating health made difficult. He helped repair fencing, provided equipment when the Carson machinery broke down, and even brought meals that Linda had prepared when it became clear that Margaret was struggling with depression. The gesture appeared kind, the actions of a good neighbor supporting a family in crisis. Nobody questioned Weber's motives. Nobody thought to wonder why he inserted himself so thoroughly into the lives of the family whose daughter had vanished from a barn 50 feet from his fence line. What nobody could know was that Weber's helpfulness served multiple purposes. It allowed him to monitor how much the Carsons knew, what they suspected, whether any new evidence had emerged. It reinforced his image as a caring neighbor, building social capital that insulated him from suspicion. And perhaps most disturbingly, it gave him a form of control over the situation, allowing him to be present in the aftermath of the crime he had committed, to witness the suffering he had caused while maintaining a mask of concern and compassion. The evidence collected in June 1987 sat in storage, preserved but essentially useless with the forensic capabilities available at the time. The soil samples taken from the fence line, from Weber's tractor, from Emily's clothing found near the barn, contained microscopic signatures that could tell a complete story of what happened that evening. But in 1990, forensic geology was barely recognized as a legitimate investigative tool. The technology to analyze pollen grains at the species level didn't exist. The databases to compare soil mineral compositions weren't established. The samples were preserved in the hope that someday, somehow, science would advance enough to make them relevant. Detective Richardson reviewed Emily's case file periodically, a ritual he maintained even after retirement in 2003. He had worked dozens of cases during his career, solved most of them, but Emily Carson haunted him in ways the resolved cases never did. He knew in his gut that Thomas Weber was involved. The proximity, the timing, the tractor tracks that Weber claimed were old but couldn't be definitively dated, all of it pointed to Weber. But knowing and proving were entirely different things, and Richardson had no proof. Just suspicions that would never hold up in court, just a feeling that the helpful neighbor was actually a monster hiding in plain sight. So here's something I'd like to know. What's the weather like where you're watching from today? Our story takes place across Nebraska seasons, from that June evening when Emily vanished to winter cold cases that seemed as frozen as the landscape. Weather played a crucial role in this investigation. Summer storms washing away evidence, seasonal changes affecting search efforts. Drop your location and current weather in the comments. It's always fascinating to connect with viewers from different places, all drawn to these stories of justice delayed but not denied. David Carson died in February 2008, 20 years and 8 months after his daughter disappeared. He was 73 years old, his health deteriorating from a combination of heart disease and what doctors politely called failure to thrive, though everyone knew it was a broken heart that killed him. David spent his final days in the farmhouse where he had lived his entire life, where he had raised Emily, where he had maintained a vigil for 2 decades, hoping for answers that never came. His last coherent words, spoken to Margaret the day before he died, were, "Find her. Promise me you'll find her." Margaret promised, though she had no idea how she could possibly keep that promise. Margaret sold most of the farmland in 2009, keeping only the 10 acres surrounding the house and barn. She was 72, alone, and had no use for the fields that required maintenance she couldn't provide. The money from the sale went into a trust dedicated to supporting missing persons investigations in Nebraska, a practical memorial to Emily that might help other families avoid the limbo Margaret had endured for over 2 decades. She remained in the farmhouse, unable to leave the last place Emily had been, maintained by routines that no longer had purpose but provided structure to days that otherwise stretched empty before her. Thomas Weber attended David Carson's funeral, sitting in the back row of the Waverly Lutheran Church, his face appropriately somber. He spoke to Margaret afterward, offering condolences, mentioning how much he had respected David, how tragic it was that David died without answers. Margaret accepted his words with the grace she had shown throughout her ordeal, never imagining that the man expressing sympathy was the reason her husband had died of a broken heart. Weber himself was aging, his health declining through the 2000s and into the 2010s. He developed diabetes, then heart disease, his body slowly failing in ways that seemed almost merciful compared to the vigorous decades he had enjoyed while Emily Carson lay wherever he had put her. Linda Weber died in 2016, a stroke that took her quickly, and Thomas moved to a nursing care facility in Lincoln, no longer able to maintain his farm or live independently. The Weber farm was sold in 2017, purchased by a young family from Iowa who saw potential in the land and buildings. Thomas signed the papers from his nursing home room, his hands shaking with palsy, his mind still sharp enough to remember everything he had done on that property. Everything he had buried, everything he had hidden for 30 years while living an apparently normal life, while helping the Carson family with farm work, while maintaining the persona of a good neighbor who had nothing to hide. Throughout these decades, Emily's case remained officially unsolved but wasn't entirely forgotten. Cold case investigators reviewed the file periodically, looking for new angles or overlooked evidence. The advent of DNA analysis in the 1990s brought brief hope, but there was no biological evidence to test. Emily's body had never been found. The soil samples and botanical evidence collected in 1987 remained in storage, their potential unrecognized until forensic science advanced enough to make them meaningful. By 2020, Emily Carson had been missing for 33 years. Margaret was 83, her health fragile, her hope nearly extinguished. The community that had rallied around her in 1987 had largely moved on, many of the original searchers having died or moved away themselves. The annual memorial service on June 12th drew fewer than a dozen people, mostly Margaret's generation, those who remembered Emily as a real person rather than a historical tragedy. But cold cases have a peculiar characteristic. They never truly die. They wait. They persist in filing cabinets and storage rooms, in the memories of detectives who couldn't solve them, in the hearts of families who never stopped searching. They wait for technology to advance, for new witnesses to come forward, for some shift in circumstance that finally brings truth to light. Emily Carson's case waited 37 years, waited for Thomas Weber to die and his property to be sold, waited for a new generation of forensic scientists to recognize what the soil samples had been saying all along, waited for justice that everyone except Margaret Carson had given up believing would ever come. The year 2024 brought a revolution in cold case investigation across America. Forensic genealogy had solved the Golden State Killer case in 2018, demonstrating that DNA databases and family tree analysis could identify perpetrators decades after their crimes. This success inspired law enforcement agencies nationwide to re-examine cold cases with fresh tools and techniques. The Nebraska State Patrol established a dedicated cold case unit in January 2024, staffed by investigators trained in modern forensic methods and committed to bringing resolution to families who had waited years or decades for answers. Detective Sarah Chen led the new unit, a 38-year-old investigator who had built her career on the belief that unsolved cases were simply cases waiting for the right technology or insight. Chen's team began by reviewing Nebraska's oldest cold cases, prioritizing those where physical evidence had been preserved but never fully analyzed. Emily Carson's case file, marked with decades of notations and updates that led nowhere, caught Chen's attention immediately, not because of the investigation's thoroughness, which was evident, but because of the soil samples collected in 1987 and never adequately tested. Forensic geology has advanced dramatically in the past 15 years, Chen told her team during a case review in February 2024. We can now analyze soil composition at the molecular level, identify pollen grains down to specific species, even determine if soil has been moved from one location to another based on stratification patterns. Those 1987 samples are a time capsule. They've been preserved for 37 years, waiting for us to have the technology to read what they're telling us. Chen contacted Dr. Robert Friedman, a forensic geologist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln who specialized in agricultural soil analysis. Friedman had testified in several cases where soil evidence proved crucial, and his laboratory had equipment that could extract information from samples that would have been meaningless in 1987. When Chen explained the Emily Carson case, Friedman's interest was immediate. This was exactly the kind of historical evidence that could demonstrate how far forensic science had progressed. The soil samples were retrieved from evidence storage on March 1, 2024. After 37 years in controlled conditions, the samples were still viable, the soil and botanical material preserved well enough for comprehensive analysis. Dr. Friedman's laboratory began processing immediately, and within weeks, the samples began telling a story that investigators in 1987 could never have extracted. The soil samples collected from the fence line in June 1987 contained secrets visible only to 21st century technology. Under Dr. Friedman's electron microscopes, the dirt that had appeared uniform to the naked eye revealed itself as a complex mixture of minerals, organic matter, and microscopic plant materials. Each grain of sand, each particle of clay, each fragment of decomposed vegetation carried a geological signature as unique as a fingerprint. The samples from Emily's clothing, taken from the barn floor where she had stood before disappearing, showed a specific composition. Low-S soil, typical of eastern Nebraska, mixed with particles of limestone aggregate commonly used in barn construction and traces of hay chaff from the feed storage area. But the samples taken from the fence line told a different story. The soil there contained the same low-S base, but with additions that didn't match the Carson barn environment. There were traces of diesel fuel, microscopic rubber particles consistent with tractor tires, and most significantly, pollen grains from plants that didn't grow anywhere on Carson property. Dr. Friedman's team identified pollen from Russian thistle, an invasive species that Thomas Weber had been fighting on his property throughout the 1980s, but that the Carsons had never had to deal with. They found pollen from a specific variety of corn hybrid that Weber had planted in 1987, but that the Carsons didn't use. The fence line soil was contaminated with material from Weber's property, suggesting recent contact between the two areas. Even more damning were the samples taken from Thomas Weber's tractor in June 1987. At the time, the tractor had appeared clean, and investigators lacked the technology to find what couldn't be seen with the naked eye. But soil has memory. Microscopic particles lodge in crevices, beneath seats, in the treads of tires where they remain long after visible dirt has been washed away. When Detective Chen obtained a court order to examine the tractor, which had been sold along with the Weber property and was now stored in a machine shed on the new owner's land, Dr. Friedman's team found what 1987 investigators couldn't have detected. Samples extracted from beneath the tractor seat, from the floor pan where a driver's boots would rest, and from deep within the tire treads contained soil that precisely matched the fence line samples. The mineral composition, the pollen signatures, even the limestone aggregate particles were identical. More significantly, embedded in these samples were fibers that matched Emily Carson's University of Nebraska t-shirt, the clothing she had been wearing when she disappeared. The fibers contained traces of her DNA, preserved in the soil matrix for 37 years, waiting for technology that could finally give them voice. "This is as close to a smoking gun as soil evidence gets," Dr. Friedman told Detective Chen during a presentation of his findings in April 2024. Thomas Weber's tractor was at that fence line on or very close to June 12, 1987. The soil composition includes materials that would have dried and blown away within days if deposited earlier. The presence of Emily's clothing fibers in soil samples from the tractor floor suggests direct contact between her and that vehicle. She was in or on that tractor. Chen's team now had physical evidence connecting Weber to Emily's disappearance, but Thomas Weber had died in December 2022 at age 91. He had lived 74 years after Emily vanished, 35 of those years knowing he had gotten away with murder, never facing justice, never confessing, taking his secrets to the grave. Or so it seemed. but the dead, Chen knew, often leave evidence the living cannot. Weber's tractor was evidence, his property was evidence, and somewhere on the 180 acres he had farmed for 40 years, Emily Carson's body was waiting to be found. The challenge was determining where on that vast property to search. Ground-penetrating radar could detect anomalies in soil density that might indicate buried remains, but surveying 180 acres would take months and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Chen needed to narrow the search area, and to do that, she needed to understand Thomas Weber's behavior patterns, his routines, his psychology. The investigation team obtained search warrants for Weber's personal effects, items that had been stored by his estate after his death. In a storage unit in Lincoln, they found boxes of personal papers, journals, and records that Weber's distant relatives hadn't bothered to examine. Among these materials, investigators found something extraordinary. A journal Weber had maintained from 1985 to 2019, sporadic entries that documented his daily life, his thoughts, his farming activities. The entries weren't confessions. Weber was too careful for that. But they contained patterns, references that took on sinister meaning when viewed through the lens of what investigators now knew. An entry from June 13, 1987, the day after Emily disappeared, read, "Disturbed ground near the equipment shed. We'll need to reseed that area come spring. Some things are better left buried and forgotten." An entry from June 1988, 1 year after Emily's death. "Took flowers to the spot today. Nobody knows, nobody will ever know." Entries throughout the 1990s and 2000s referenced the place with no further explanation, but with enough frequency to suggest Weber visited this location regularly, maintaining some kind of private ritual. Chen's team cross-referenced the journal entries with historical aerial photographs of the Weber property, images taken by the USDA for agricultural surveys throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Modern photogrammetry software could analyze these images, detecting changes in vegetation patterns, soil color, or topography that might indicate disturbed ground. An area near Weber's equipment shed, approximately 300 feet from the fence line separating his property from the Carsons, showed anomalies in aerial photographs from 1987 that disappeared in later images as vegetation returned. On May 15, 2024, Detective Chen led a team to the former Weber property, now owned by the Mitchell family who had purchased it in 2017. The Mitchells had been horrified to learn their property might contain the remains of a missing girl, but they cooperated fully, grateful that Emily might finally be found. The equipment shed Weber had referenced in his journal still stood, weathered but intact. 300 feet north of the shed, in an area that was now overgrown with weeds and volunteer trees, ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly. The anomaly was approximately 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. The soil density pattern suggested this area had been excavated and refilled, the stratification layers disrupted in ways that only human activity could explain. The radar also detected what appeared to be organic material, including what might be fabric and possibly human remains. The density and positioning were consistent with a burial. The excavation began on May 16th, conducted by forensic anthropologists from the University of Nebraska, and supervised by Detective Chen's team. They worked slowly, carefully, documenting every layer of soil, photographing every stage of the process. At a depth of 43 inches, they encountered fabric, blue denim, deteriorated by decades underground but still recognizable. Further excavation revealed more clothing, the remnants of a University of Nebraska t-shirt, boots, and beneath all of this, human skeletal remains. The bones were measured, photographed, and carefully removed. A forensic anthropologist confirmed at the scene that the remains were human, female, approximately 18 to 20 years old, based on bone development and dental characteristics. The skeleton showed evidence of trauma, fractured hyoid bone consistent with strangulation, defensive fractures on the forearm bones suggesting the victim had tried to protect herself. The remains had been buried with care, positioned as if at rest, hands folded across the chest. This wasn't a body hastily hidden. It was a burial that showed some form of respect or ritual, as if the killer had cared about the victim even as he took her life. DNA analysis confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains were Emily Marie Carson, missing since June 12, 1987. She had been buried 300 feet from Thomas Weber's equipment shed, less than half a mile from her family's farm, close enough that if someone had known where to look, she could have been found within hours of her disappearance. She had been there all along, beneath Weber's property, while he farmed around her grave, while he attended memorial services for her, while he helped her parents with farm work and pretended to care about finding her. The forensic evidence told the story that Emily couldn't. The soil beneath her body matched samples from the Carson barn, confirming she had been killed there or immediately after being taken from there. The timeline reconstruction suggested Weber had used his tractor to transport Emily's body from the fence line to the burial site, a journey of less than a quarter-mile across his own property. The presence of welding slag in the grave soil suggested Weber had been welding near the burial site, possibly creating a metal marker or memorial that he later removed. The journal entries about bringing flowers, about visiting the place, indicated Weber had maintained a relationship with Emily's grave, returning to it regularly over 3 decades. If you've stayed with us this far in Emily's story, you understand something profound about persistence and the power of modern science to speak for the dead. Detective Chen's team and Dr. Friedman's laboratory gave Emily the voice she had been denied for 37 years. If this story has moved you, if it reminds you that justice can arrive even after decades, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps ensure we continue bringing attention to cold cases like Emily's, cases where families waited for years for answers that modern forensic techniques can finally provide. Share this video with someone who appreciates how soil science and dedication can combine to solve the seemingly unsolvable. Leave a comment about what aspect of this investigation impressed you most. Building this community of viewers who care about cold case justice creates awareness that makes a difference. Margaret Carson was 97 years old when Detective Chen knocked on her door on May 17, 2024, to tell her that Emily had been found. Margaret had waited 36 years, 10 months, and 5 days for this moment. She had buried her husband without answers. She had spent decades wondering if Emily was still alive somewhere, suffering, waiting to be rescued. She had imagined every possible scenario, every potential fate, torture her mind inflicted because not knowing was worse than any truth could be. "We found her," Chen said simply, her voice gentle. "We brought Emily home." Margaret didn't cry. She had no tears left after 37 years of grief. She simply nodded, her hands clutching the arms of her chair, and whispered, "Thank God. Thank God." Then, after a moment, "Was it Thomas?" Chen nodded. "All the evidence points to him. I'm so sorry it took us this long to prove it." Margaret's response was not what Chen expected. "Don't apologize," Margaret said, her voice surprisingly strong. "You found her. You gave me the answer I've waited my entire adult life to receive. Thomas is dead. He can't face trial. But Emily can finally rest in the family cemetery beside her father. That's more than I ever thought I'd have." The discovery of Emily Carson's remains sent shockwaves through Lancaster County and beyond. The case that had haunted Nebraska for 37 years was finally solved, but the resolution brought more pain than relief for many who remembered Emily as a vibrant teenager with dreams of veterinary school. The news that Thomas Weber, respected farmer and church deacon, the neighbor who had helped the Carson family for decades, had been Emily's killer, challenged everything the community believed about their ability to recognize evil. The Nebraska State Patrol held a press conference on May 20, 2024, to announce the findings. Detective Sarah Chen stood at a podium in the state capitol building, flanked by Dr. Robert Friedman and Sheriff Amanda Torres, who now held the position William Drayton had occupied in 1987. Chen detailed the investigation, the forensic soil analysis, the tractor evidence, and the discovery of Emily's remains. She was careful not to reveal certain details that might be needed for legal proceedings, though with Weber dead, there would be no trial, no courtroom drama, No opportunity for justice in the traditional sense. Emily Carson was 18 years old when she was taken from her family, Chen said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words. For 37 years, her parents lived without answers, without closure, without justice. While we cannot prosecute Thomas Weber, we can ensure that Emily's story is told, that her family finally has peace, and that the forensic techniques used to solve this case help bring resolution to other families still waiting for answers. The media coverage was extensive. National news outlets picked up the story, fascinated by the forensic soil science that had cracked a nearly 4-decade-old case. Dr. Friedman's laboratory received calls from law enforcement agencies across the country asking about applying similar techniques to their own cold cases. The Emily Carson case became a teaching example in forensic science programs, demonstrating how evidence preservation and advancing technology could eventually speak for victims long after their deaths. But for the residents of Lancaster County, particularly those in the Waverly area who had known both Emily and Thomas Weber, the revelation was personally devastating. People who had attended church with Weber, who had bought hay from him, who had sat beside him at Emily's memorial services, struggled to reconcile the helpful neighbor they remembered with the killer the evidence revealed. How had they missed it? How had Weber maintained his facade so perfectly? How many times had they shaken his hand, thanked him for his community service, never suspecting the secret he carried? Linda Weber's relatives issued a statement through their attorney expressing shock and sorrow. Linda had died in 2016, never knowing, or at least never revealing, that her husband of 40 years had committed murder. Had she suspected? Had she known but remained silent out of fear or misplaced loyalty? These questions would never be answered. Linda's death had taken those secrets with her, leaving only speculation about what she might have witnessed or chosen to ignore during the years after Emily's disappearance. The psychological profile that emerged from Weber's journals and the physical evidence painted a picture of a man who had committed an impulsive act and then spent decades managing the aftermath. Forensic psychologist Dr. Raymond Foster, who consulted on the case, suggested that Weber's killing of Emily hadn't been premeditated. The evidence indicated a confrontation that escalated, a moment of violence that Weber couldn't undo. What followed was 37 years of careful performance, of inserting himself into the Carson family's life to monitor what they knew, of maintaining the persona of a caring neighbor while secretly visiting Emily's grave to maintain some twisted form of connection to his victim. Killers like Weber often experience a compulsion to stay close to their crimes, Dr. Foster explained during a consultation with Detective Chen's team. Attending the memorial services, helping the family, visiting the gravesite, these behaviors gave Weber a sense of control. He could observe the investigation's progress, ensure his alibi remained solid, and satisfy whatever psychological need drove him to stay connected to what he'd done. It's not remorse exactly. It's more like possessiveness, a need to remain part of the narrative he created. The question of why Weber killed Emily remained partially unanswered. The forensic evidence proved he had done it, but his journals never explicitly stated his motive. Investigators theorized based on context clues and witness statements from 1987. Emily had been in the barn at the time many farmers were finishing their day's work. Weber's property shared a fence line with the barn. The horses had reacted to something that frightened them. The most likely scenario was that Weber had approached the fence, perhaps to discuss something mundane like borrowing equipment or coordinating a property line repair. Emily had gone to speak with him, and something in their interaction had triggered violence. One theory suggested sexual assault as a motive, though the skeletal remains couldn't confirm or deny this possibility after 37 years. Another theory proposed that Weber had made an inappropriate advance that Emily rejected, and her rejection triggered rage. A third possibility was that Emily had witnessed something on Weber's property that made her a threat, though what that might have been remained speculation. Without a confession, and with Weber dead, the precise trigger for violence would remain unknown. What was certain was that Thomas Weber had strangled 18-year-old Emily Carson, transported her body to a pre-dug grave on his property, and then lived with that secret for the rest of his life. Emily's funeral took place on June 12, 2024, exactly 37 years to the day after her disappearance. The service was held at Waverly Lutheran Church, the same church where her memorial services had been held for decades, the same church where Thomas Weber had once served as a deacon. Over 300 people attended, a mixture of Emily's generation now in their 50s, investigators who had worked her case over the years, and community members who had never met Emily but felt connected to her story. Margaret Carson sat in the front pew, flanked by cousins and friends who had supported her through the decades. She was frail at 97, her body weakened by age and illness, but her mind remained sharp. She had requested that the service focus not on Emily's death, but on her life, on the bright, kind, ambitious girl who had loved horses and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Photos displayed around the church showed Emily at various ages, as a child feeding chickens, as a teenager riding Scout in her graduation cap and gown, always smiling, always vibrant with life and possibility. Detective Chen attended the funeral, sitting in the back with Dr. Friedman and other members of the investigation team. Chen had worked dozens of cold cases, but few had affected her as deeply as Emily's. Perhaps it was the 37-year timeline, the knowledge that Emily had been so close to home all along. Perhaps it was meeting Margaret, seeing the toll that decades of not knowing had taken on a woman who deserved answers long before she received them. Or perhaps it was the horses, those 12 animals who had tried so hard to tell anyone who would listen that something terrible had happened, witnesses whose testimony couldn't be translated until soil science spoke for them. Emily was buried in the Carson family cemetery, a small plot on the 10 acres Margaret still owned. Her grave was beside her father's, the headstone reading simply, Emily Marie Carson, 1969 or in 1987, beloved daughter, forever in our hearts. Margaret had chosen not to include taken too soon, or gone but not forgotten, or any of the other phrases common on graves of those who died young. Emily's age at death told that story. The words, forever in our hearts, were enough. The impact of Emily's case extended far beyond Lancaster County. The Nebraska State Patrol expanded its cold case unit funding, recognizing that preserved evidence from unsolved crimes might contain answers waiting for technology to catch up. Law enforcement agencies across the country contacted Dr. Friedman's laboratory requesting soil analysis on their own cold cases. Forensic geology, long overshadowed by DNA analysis and digital forensics, gained recognition as a powerful investigative tool, particularly for cases from the 1970s and 1980s, when soil evidence had been collected but never adequately analyzed. Several other Nebraska cold cases were reopened based on soil evidence. In Iowa, investigators applied similar techniques to a 1992 missing person case and identified a suspect within 6 months. In Kansas, soil analysis linked a series of disappearances to a single perpetrator who had evaded detection for 20 years. Emily Carson's case became the catalyst for a new era of cold case investigation, proof that no evidence is ever truly outdated if properly preserved, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved through persistence and scientific advancement. Margaret Carson died on October 3, 2024, 4 months after Emily's funeral. She passed peacefully in her sleep at the farmhouse where she had lived for 66 years, where she had raised Emily, where she had waited for answers longer than Emily had been alive. Her obituary noted that she was reunited with her beloved daughter and husband, finally at peace after a lifetime of searching. The farm was sold, the proceeds going to the Emily Carson Memorial Foundation, an organization Margaret had established to fund forensic science scholarships and support families of missing persons. The case of Emily Carson reminds us that evidence never forgets, even when memories fade and perpetrators believe themselves safe. Those soil samples collected in 1987, dismissed as uninformative with available technology, waited 37 years to speak. The horses that screamed their witness testimony in June 1987 tried to tell the truth that humans couldn't understand, until decades later. And Emily herself, buried in darkness for nearly 4 decades, finally found her voice through modern science and investigators who refused to let her case remain unsolved. If Emily's story has moved you, if it's demonstrated the crucial importance of preserving evidence and never giving up on cold cases, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support enables us to continue bringing attention to cases like hers, cases that might otherwise be forgotten but deserve to be told. Share this video with someone who appreciates how determination, scientific advancement, and a commitment to justice can finally bring answers to families who waited decades. Leave a comment about what aspect of this case impacted you most deeply. Building this community of viewers who care about cold case justice creates awareness that can make a real difference for families still waiting for answers. Thomas Weber lived 74 years after killing Emily Carson. He attended her memorial services, helped her parents with farm work, and maintained a facade of innocence while visiting her grave on his property. He died believing he had gotten away with murder, that his secret would remain buried with Emily. But dirt doesn't forget. Pollen tells stories across decades, and forensic science, patient and persistent, eventually gives voice to victims who can no longer speak for themselves. Detective Sarah Chen keeps a photo on her desk in the Nebraska State Patrol Cold Case Unit offices. It shows Emily Carson in her graduation cap and gown, smiling at the camera with her whole future ahead of her. Beside it is a small glass vial containing soil from the Carson farm, a reminder that evidence preserved with care can wait as long as necessary to deliver justice. Every cold case is a promise we made to a victim and their family, Chen tells new investigators who join her unit. Emily waited 37 years for us to keep that promise. We can't give her back the life Thomas Weber stole, but we gave her family truth, and we ensured her story became a catalyst for solving other cases. That's the least we owe to everyone still waiting for answers. Some mysteries aren't meant to remain unsolved forever. Some secrets, buried in darkness, eventually surface. And some voices, silenced by violence, finally speak through soil and science and the determination of investigators who refuse to give up. Emily Carson spoke through dirt beneath fingernails, through pollen grains invisible to the naked eye, through tractor tracks and journal entries and evidence that waited patiently for technology to evolve. Justice delayed 37 years, but justice nonetheless. For Emily, for Margaret, for every family that refuses to stop searching, refuses to stop hoping, refuses to accept that some questions will never be answered. The horses knew, they tried to tell us. And 37 years later, the soil spoke the truth they had witnessed that June evening when an 18-year-old girl with dreams of saving animals vanished 50 feet from safety. Emily Carson is finally home.